Hey everyone, I'm Essential US History, and let's be real, history can be a bit of a downer sometimes, but it's also full of crucial lessons. And today, we're diving into one of the biggest economic downturns in modern history, the Great Depression. Now, most people associate the Great Depression with the stock market crash of 1929. And while that event certainly played a role, it wasn't the whole story. Not even close. To truly understand what caused this decade-long economic crisis, we need to dig deeper, way deeper, into the long-term factors that had been brewing for years. Think of it like this. The stock market crash was the match, but the tinderbox, the fuel for the fire, had been building for a while. Let's rewind to the Roaring '20s, a time of flappers, jazz, and, well, massive economic inequality. See, during the 1920s, the gap between the rich and everyone else grew wider than a Charleston dancer's stance. The wealthiest 1% of Americans controlled a whopping 30% of the nation's income. To put that into perspective, imagine a pie chart where a tiny sliver gets to gobble up almost a third of the entire pie, not exactly a recipe for economic balance, right? This concentration of wealth at the top meant that the majority of Americans had less money to spend on goods and services, which are the building blocks of a healthy economy. Think of it like this. If most people can only afford the bare necessities, who's going to buy all the new cars, radios, and fancy appliances that factories are churning out? This imbalance in purchasing power would come back to bite the economy in a big way. Adding insult to injury, wages for the average worker remained relatively stagnant during the 1920s. So not only were the rich getting richer, but the majority of Americans were stuck in a financial rut, unable to keep up with the booming economy and the rising cost of living. This lack of widespread prosperity created a fragile foundation for the economic boom of the 1920s. It was like building a skyscraper on a foundation of sand. It might look impressive for a while, but it's only a matter of time before the whole thing comes crashing down. The 1920s saw the rise of consumer credit. It was like someone handed America a shiny new credit card and said, "Go ahead, treat yourself." Installment plans became all the rage, allowing people to buy everything from cars to refrigerators on credit. Now, buying on credit can be useful, but it relies on a pretty big assumption that people will have the income in the future to pay back what they owe today. And for many Americans, that assumption would crumble faster than a stale loaf of bread. See, when the economy took a downturn, those installment plans became a huge burden. People lost their jobs, their incomes dried up, and suddenly those monthly payments felt less like convenient installments and more like insurmountable mountains of debt. Imagine trying to keep your head above water while also being weighed down by a mountain of debt. That's what it was like for millions of Americans during the Great Depression. And as more and more people defaulted on their loans, banks began to feel the heat. This widespread defaulting on loans created a domino effect throughout the financial system. Banks, who had been all too eager to lend money during the boom times, were now facing massive losses. Remember that fragile foundation we talked about earlier? Well, the weight of all that consumer debt just sent a crack right through it. To make matters worse, many banks had engaged in risky lending practices, giving loans to people who couldn't afford them just to keep the money flowing. It was like throwing gasoline on an already raging fire. The combination of easy credit, widespread debt, and risky lending practices created a ticking time bomb that was just waiting for the right moment to explode. And as we know, explode it did. Let's talk about the stock market, a place that can seem as mysterious and unpredictable as the weather. In the 1920s, the stock market was the place to be, with everyone from seasoned investors to everyday folks trying to get a piece of the action. The problem was, many of these investors weren't buying stocks based on sound financial analysis or company performance, but rather on speculation and hype. It was like a giant game of musical chairs, with everyone hoping they wouldn't be the one left standing when the music stopped. This speculative frenzy created a stock market bubble, where prices were driven not by actual value, but by the belief that they would continue to rise indefinitely. It was the economic equivalent of believing that you could fly if you just flapped your arms hard enough. People were buying stocks on margin, meaning they were borrowing money from brokers to purchase even more stock, further inflating the bubble. It was like building a house of cards on top of a house of cards, impressive but incredibly unstable. Then came the crash of 1929. The bubble burst, stock prices plummeted, and investors, many of whom had borrowed heavily to buy in at inflated prices, were left holding the bag, a very empty, very worthless bag. The stock market crash wasn't just a financial disaster, it was a psychological blow. It shattered the illusion of prosperity and exposed the underlying weaknesses that had been lurking beneath the surface of the booming economy. The crash sent shockwaves through the financial system, wiping out savings, bankrupting businesses, and leaving millions of Americans in a state of economic despair. And remember that domino effect we talked about earlier? Well, the stock market crash was like someone had just tipped over the first domino, setting off a chain reaction that would ripple through the entire economy. Here's a thought. Can you have too much of a good thing? When it comes to economics, the answer is a resounding yes. You see, throughout the 1920s, American factories were humming along, churning out goods at an unprecedented rate. New technologies and manufacturing techniques allowed for mass production, leading to a surplus of goods, from cars and radios to crops and textiles. The problem was, people could only buy so many radios and cars, even with the allure of installment plans. As supply outstripped demand, prices began to fall. Farmers, who had increased production to meet wartime needs, found themselves with surplus crops and plummeting prices. Factories faced a similar dilemma, with warehouses overflowing with unsold goods. This overproduction led to a domino effect of its own. Businesses faced with declining profits began to lay off workers. Those laid-off workers then had less money to spend, further decreasing demand and leading to more layoffs. Imagine a game of hot potato, but instead of a potato, it's unemployment, and no one wants to be left holding it. As factories sat idle and fields lay fallow, the economy spiraled downward. The Great Depression wasn't just a time of financial hardship, it was a time of profound uncertainty and fear. The American dream, once seemingly within reach, felt like a distant memory. The experience of the Great Depression highlighted the interconnectedness of the global economy. When one major player, like the United States, experiences an economic downturn, it can send shockwaves throughout the world, impacting trade, finance, and the lives of millions. As we've seen, the Great Depression wasn't just a stock market crash or a banking crisis, it was a human crisis. And nowhere was this more evident than in the struggles of farmers and workers. Let's start with the farmers. During World War I, demand for agricultural products was high. Farmers took out loans to buy more land and equipment, expecting the good times to roll on. However, after the war, demand plummeted, leaving farmers with surplus crops and mounting debts. Imagine pouring your heart and soul into your work, only to see the fruits of your labor wither away, both literally and figuratively. That was the harsh reality for countless farmers during the Great Depression. Adding insult to injury, a severe drought hit the Great Plains in the 1930s, turning fertile farmland into a dust bowl. Crops failed, livestock perished, and families were forced to abandon their homes in search of work and sustenance. The situation wasn't much better for factory workers. As demand for manufactured goods plummeted, factories shut down or drastically cut back production. Millions of workers found themselves jobless, with little hope of finding new employment. Imagine the despair of standing in line for hours at a soup kitchen, the gnawing hunger in your stomach, a constant reminder of your circumstances. This was the reality for millions during the Great Depression. The Great Depression exposed the vulnerability of workers, many of whom lacked any form of social safety net. There were no unemployment benefits, no food stamps, and no government programs to help them weather the economic storm. The struggles of farmers and workers during the Great Depression serve as a stark reminder that economic downturns are not just about numbers and statistics. They are about people's lives, their dreams, and their ability to provide for themselves and their families. So, there you have it. The long-term causes of the Great Depression, a perfect storm of inequality, debt speculation, overproduction, and hardship. Understanding these long-term causes helps us grasp the complexity of the Great Depression and the lessons we can learn to prevent future economic crises. It's easy to look back and judge the decisions made in the past, but the real value in studying history lies in understanding how those decisions were made and what we can learn from them. The Great Depression, for all its hardship and despair, offers valuable lessons about the importance of economic stability, social safety nets, and responsible financial practices. By studying the past, we can hopefully create a more just and equitable future. Until next time, this is Essential U.S. History, reminding you to keep asking questions and keep learning. Please click like and subscribe for more insightful content. Essential U.S. History.